Pan-African Review is a platform that challenges assumptions about Africa and a space for introspective perspectives on matters of concern to Africans. Good afternoon and welcome to the Pan-African Review podcast. This is your online spot for African discourse. I am your host, Mahatma Ulimwengu, and today we have a very special show for you. I'll be joined once more by Mr. Yusuf Serunkuma. Of course, we've had him on this podcast before, but recently he penned an article titled Palestine and Africa's Political Intellectual Quagmire. The subheadline here written, "What we are witnessing in Palestine, in both Gaza and the West Bank, is a more contemporary replay of colonialism and its manifestations, apartheid, violence, ethnic cleansing, and genocide." So we're going to discuss with him on that issue, specifically with regards to Africa, what he has to say about that. So let's invite Mr. Serunkuma, and we will be back with him. So we want to discuss your article in the Pan-African Review over the past week or so, titled Palestine and Africa's Political Intellectual Quagmire. So just for anyone who hasn't read the article, what are the lessons for Africans to take away from the ongoing settler colonial violence in Palestine?
Students of colonialism and colonization, and as a country as a continent trying to overcome the continuity of colonialism, as a continent which claims to be independent as we speak. There's plenty of lessons to learn from the things with which we use, the orientation with which we use to talk about our present and our futures, the things that we pride in ourselves, things such as international law, the locus of our conversation, to say, that's against international law. That is undemocratic. This is a violation of human rights. This is what the market enables. We're in a free market dispensation. So things like private property, right? So if this is the orientation around which we imagine a future for Africa, and this being sort of declarations that we've learned as students of the colonial school, as conscripts of our colonial modernity, these things nowadays don't seem to make any sense. Especially for people who have often pointed to the Western world as the exemplars, right? You point to the Western world as the shining symbol of democratic aspiration, of private property, of human rights law, of international law. They don't seem to make sense now, And if you've been reading my scholarship, my activism for quite some time, I've often argued that they actually don't make sense. Right? But I think this time it has been profoundly demonstrated that it actually means so little. In concluding the last piece, I note that what actually international law means is if you have control over the press and military power, and you have to have absolute control over the press. If you can manage to marshal those together, you have international law in your hands.
Okay, so we'll get to all those subjects of international law and all that, but just focusing on Palestine and Africa for the moment. So what parallels could you draw from the South African apartheid regime of the second half of the 20th century and the Israeli occupation and seizure of Palestinian land? What are the parallels that you see between those two apartheid states?
I mean, if you want to, I mean, the question which is being discussed now is do we stick to September 7, October 7, or this thing has a history? Right? It has a history. So, the British colonial government decided that you should settle Europeans identifying as Jews in a place somewhere else away from Europe. Right? Just the same way the Germans settled people in Namibia, they settled some British in Kenya, they settled Dutch, Boers and British in South Africa. So they settled Europeans identifying as Jews, right? So they moved and settled them in Palestine. Oh, by the way, you need to remember, it wasn't actually just Palestine, it was suggested that they be settled in Uganda. Right? Yeah. So I think the British colonial government promised 6,000 hectares of land to Europeans identifying as Jews in Uganda. Right?
Right.
I think you go beyond Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, and Kenya would be, the hosts of, but it's typical case of settler colonialism that, people come and settle. And then when you move to the question of apartheid, apartheid means separate existence, a separate existence, different laws for different people.
Yes.
You have this, we've seen plenty of this documented in Israel. Plenty of this has been documented. So clearly you have an apartheid system. So if you go further back, if you have a historical mind, if you care to work historically, you're going to go back before 7 October, and you realize that apartheid has been documented,
since
occupation has been documented.
Yeah, since the founding, since the 1948.
Exactly. Since 1948. Yeah.
Yeah. So the issue of land itself, who owns the land, who controls it, has always been controversial. So in Southern African countries, especially, with some calling for expropriation without compensation. So to date, only Zimbabwe has dared to engage in expropriation and redistribution of land. I'd like to know your take on this. Do you think it might be a bit cowardly for South African leaders to be vocal about the issue of Palestinian lands while shying away from confronting a similar issue in their own country?
I think the apartheid government in South Africa was smarter than Israel.
Yeah,
smarter than Israel.
How so?
Because they realized they couldn't sustain an apartheid for long, and what they did very smartly was to conscript members of the ANC into the governance question. Right, so they were smart in that context that, when protests against the apartheid government in South Africa became really intense, they ran to Robben Island, got the heroes, the celebrities of the struggle. They got them to Pollsmoor, then from Pollsmoor into a small hotel. And they started talking to Nelson Mandela. So they crafted Nelson Mandela, the hero of the anti-apartheid struggle, and he became president, right? And so in that context, they settled the political question. The political question of apartheid was settled, but then they forgot about the land.
Right. Yeah.
So in that context, you have to give credit to the apartheid government for realizing that this is not sustainable. We need to work with these people. We can actually find a way of keeping what we have, what we've stolen over the decades, but also settle the political question. So you would in that context appreciate the geniusity of the apartheid government in South Africa. But also you can understand, in terms of demography, there were more Black South Africans living under apartheid than Palestinians living under apartheid. In this place which used to be called Palestine, which now has Israel. So the demographics have shifted quite significantly. And I think Israel has been very smart. I don't think smart is the word. Has been very cunning in making sure that the population grows really fast.
Yeah, the right to return.
They endlessly send invites to people to return.
Yeah, that's the main population driver.
And they're happy to build more settlements because, demographically, they need to have numbers in the area. So they've been doing this trick as well, so that the numbers are kept higher than the Palestinians. And on the other hand, you make sure the Palestinians don't have, not many of them can exist, right? So continuously subsidize the number of Palestinians, make sure the conditions are not easy for them to live, and make sure you demographically the numbers of the Israelis living in this territory, right? So the comparison with South Africa is difficult in that regard. My favorite recent theorist, Slavoj Žižek, wrote this piece in The Guardian where he argued that if Mandela had actually won, he would never be a darling of the Western world. And I think that's to the point that you raised about Zimbabwe, right?
Yes.
When Robert Mugabe finally said, we need to take the land back. We need the land because it's not independence without the land.
Right.
Without the economy, because colonialism is a thing about the economy. So you can't say we're independent if you don't have the land. When Mugabe did that, the Western world competed with each other in bad-mouthing Mugabe. He had been even knighted by the Queen, right? He was, I think, MBE Mugabe, something like maybe Sam Mugabe, right?
Yeah.
They took that thing away from him when he started saying, we need to take the land back.
Yeah.
So they took it away from him.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can never be a darling of the Western world if you speak economic empowerment, if you speak about getting your rights to access property and land and natural resources back, right? So this is the crisis. So you are an autocrat, a monster. You as called a regime. In modern parlance, I think after September 11, you're called a terrorist.
Yeah, exactly. So you mentioned earlier now, and in your article, you alluded to this, that Israel and Palestine obviously is equivalent to the British in Kenya, Zimbabwe in Rhodesia, or the French in Algeria, or the Belgians in Congo. So I'd like you to expound on that a bit, just mainly focusing on the philosophy of subjugating a people. How do the Israelis, do you think they learned from the British in terms of their I would like to say barbaric treatment of the Palestinians? It didn't begin, as you mentioned, on October 7th. This has been going on since the 1940s. So could you just expound on how the similarities between these colonial powers?
I mean, settler colonialism operates on a single script. You need to make sure you dominate the natives. It's as simple as that. Dominate the natives. If it means complete annihilation, you got to do that. And that's what has been done across history. The Namibians are a wonderful example, right? They committed a genocide in Namibia so as to take the land. The Americans did the same thing, over the Native Americans. In Kenya, leaders were being hanged. Dedan Kimathi was hanged, and people were killed. The colonial government killed so many people. In Congo, it's the same story. It's not a settler colony, but access to resources made that you had to kill people, right? Yeah. King Leopold killed 8 million people, and that's the lowest estimate. The highest estimate is 12. And according to George Orwell, learning that King Leopold had killed 8 million people, was wondering, maybe the number could have been exaggerated. But even if you took half of the 8 million, that was still a lot of people killed.
Yeah.
Right? So this is where you find people like George Orwell on the streets of London protesting against belligerent Congo, the massacres. 12 million, 500,000 in Namibia, close to a million. I mean, there was some story. The massacres of people in South Africa, so that take of the land. The massacres of people in what was even arrogantly named Rhodesia after the main colonial, hero. Right. The guy who made sure Namibia, Zimbabweans were being killed. And this entire territory named Southern Rhodesia, something like that, right? So this is a single script that once you become a settler, once you argue that these non-rational barbarians have to be exterminated, they don't have access to private property. It's a wonderful argument by Siba Grovogi, writing about this 1600, slave trade movement. How would you argue? Because they look like humans, but they don't have religion. They're not Christian, but they look like humans. So should we actually enslave them? The Pope Alexander the Sixth issued papal bulls to legitimate Portuguese and Spanish conquest and enslavement of Africans, they picked from the African continent. If they're non-rational barbarians, if they are not human, you have the right to take over their land. Animals don't own property. Right? Yeah. Animals, property. In fact, animals don't even own their lives. Yeah. You can take their lives and you can also take away what they might consider their own.
Yeah, so this next question is my favorite aspect of this whole thing. So it's pretty evident, we can get into a million examples, but Western governments and news media overlook and at times even justify and defend atrocities that they themselves commit on a global scale. I don't think too many people remember, but remember when Russia was a bad guy, when Putin was committing all these violent crimes to Ukrainians? I'm just curious, how do we break their monopoly on the messaging war? Because the propaganda is so consistent and ubiquitous and just frightening. The regularity, the speed, now the humanitarian pause. You get these Machiavellian terminologies and turns of phrases that some guy in the back room just try to craft it. How do we support Israel? How do we give them as much latitude to continue whilst also appeasing the masses? How do you suggest breaking this messaging monopoly that they have?
What we've often called the free press is simply the will to the truth. How much material gets published that we have sanctioned? There was a very sort of bizarre moment in British press when a British reporter said, the pictures you're about to see about the IDF operations in Israel have been cleared by the IDF. That was such a bizarre moment, right?
CNN had something similar. CNN, they accidentally released a memo to the public that said at the top, approved copy. So it was like, oh, you guys can say this. So it's like, oh, this is what we approved to say. It's ridiculous. Yeah.
Exactly. So this is why I want to turn this entire thing that, what do these traditions from Gacaca, from Ubuntu, from the Khar, from the Ummah, what do they tell us about the economy, for example? How can we integrate some of these principles to our economic? What do they tell us about the free press? What the idea of press, the idea of spreading information within the community? What can we learn? I think the Gacaca is not just the courts, but I think there's a bigger tradition behind it.
Right. A lot of the subject matter here we've already covered in this, but I'd just like you to just concisely summarize it. So now we obviously see a massive trend, a rising trend in Europe and America of censoring dissent, prohibiting public demonstrations. In France, they've been jailing Palestinian pro-Hamas protesters, as they're calling them, jailing and fining anyone who dares to defy the new, often arbitrary laws. So what lessons should Africans take from the behavior of those who have spent years and billions promoting freedom of speech and human rights in our continent, whilst even before this whole nightmare in Gaza began? The one shining beacon of freedom of speech, in my opinion, Julian Assange. Nobody ever talks about that in this Western free press media. He's been imprisoned. Pretty much the CIA was caught on record, or Mike Pompeo and Donald Trump, it was released that they actually tried to murder him. So now they're trying to kill him slowly. So what should we take as Africans now that we're seeing it so blatant? With Assange, at least it was subtle, but now it's just up. Nope, you can't say anything against Israel. What are the lessons there for Africans just to garner and then utilize?
The premise of a free press is a delusion. The premise of a free press is not there. It's inexistent. Right? A free press, the saying that the story of the hunt will always favor the hunter before the lions land right in history. That's a summary of the free press, right? This story favors the hunter, the one who has access to the tools of communication, who has power over what is normally called the mainstream. That's the tale of the hunter. It favors the hunter before the lions learn to tell their story.
Yeah.
So, now the animals can actually compete in telling their story, thanks to social media.
Yeah.
Thanks to China giving us all these cheap smartphones. So the hunted can now tell their story, and they're competing. And thanks to the rise in the internet, they can compete and reach the audiences. This is why you see a massive change in public opinion about the conflict in the settler colonial conflict and settler colonial violence in Palestine. This is why you see a massive change in public opinion, because information is easily accessible, right? So the animals are now able to tell and write their history. But for Africans, we are still deluded with the free press idea, and I think it's going to take us years to rethink what it means to have a press in the first place. Is the word free a proper prefix to press? Right? Does it make sense to say the press is free when you have so-called fact checkers, when fact checking is also entirely an idea of power, right?
Yeah.
So and I'm also talking with these ideas too. When I wrote the piece, I don't think I have like 100%, understanding of what it should be. I don't think I do. I'm just saying that what we're working with now is very, very problematic. And over the years, it has always been problematic. But right now, it has been profoundly demonstrated more than ever that the locus within which we tell our stories is really problematic. I mean, you raise a wonderful example of Julian Assange. His crime was telling us that our governments lie and they're committing massive crimes in our name.
Yeah.
Right? That's his crime. And the man is in jail.
Yeah, for over a decade now.
And when you listen to the enthusiasts of free press and democratic freedom, this is a story they don't want to talk about. Because it throws power in their face. When you talk about a free press and then you bring Julian Assange, power stares in your face like, hey, what are you talking about? Yeah. We can do whatever we want.
So in your article, you said that what constitutes international law is simply raw power, financial and military, and control over the media. We've discussed this. How can Africans effectively challenge this global order? We've seen, obviously, the destruction of Libya, the coup in Egypt, and numerous military actions waged against the people of Africa. How do you suggest Africa challenges these concepts and promote the establishment of a new global order?
I mean, I'll start with the political and intellectual elite. I think Africans need to talk with each other, right? As Julius Malema pointed out recently, in Kenya, Africans don't talk to each other.
Yeah.
If you look back in the Pan-African Review publications, I think last year I published a couple of essays, my lessons from Somalia, where I realized that actually we are mutually ignorant about each other. When I lived in Somalia for my PhD fieldwork, I realized people didn't know about Uganda, and Uganda is not too far.
Yeah.
People didn't know about Kenya, and Kenya is not far. And Uganda is the same way. They have no idea who the Somalis are, and they're their neighbors. And as you can imagine, events in Somalia affect the entire region. Because we are poor collectively as a continent. Our poverty is a condition of the continent. It's not unique to particular countries.
Yeah.
Right? It's a condition. Well, there are variations. One country could be poorer than the other, but it's a collective condition of the entire continent. It's not unique to particular countries. We are poor together. We are looted together. We looted collectively. When you see the policies that take our resources away from the continent, they're the same. When the World Bank imposes a structural adjustment, it imposes it on the entire continent, and it harasses every minister of finance across the entire continent to privatize. Right? So we are poor together. So we need to talk to each other.
Right.
We don't need to push back. No, don't push back. A colonizer will often pursue whatever interest they want. We don't know about each other. I'm telling you, we don't know. You go to Tanzania. Tanzanians don't know about Ugandans. Ugandans don't know about Tanzanians.
Yeah, that's true.
We need as a continent to sit down and strategize on how to effectively talk to each other. We need to talk to each other with respect, with mutual interests. We need to understand that the poverty of the African continent is not unique to a particular country. It's a collective condition.
Mr. Yusuf Serunkuma, thank you very much once more. Enlightening as always.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, so I hope we can keep this going. I'd love to have you on a lot more because I feel like I learn something new every time.
We should schedule.
Yes, All right. Have a good day.
Have a good one too, my friend.
All right. Cheers. Thank you very much for sticking with us till the end. Be sure to check out our website at panafricanreview.com, and we will see you guys in the next episode.